is critical. So we've got high, moderate, and low here, but we don't have a critical one. So this doesn't look like it really probably has anything, but it is tied to this, which is another wheel spinning indicator here that, hey, you know what, we probably got an exploit here with this thing, or at least something that we should try. And that OpenSSL is tied directly to this mod SSL, so we don't really have to research it. Now let's move on to Samba here, Samba 2.2.1a. Let's copy this and let's check for an exploit. So just as simple as doing this and saying exploit. And we've got a few here. We've got this Samba 2.2.8 remote code execution. We've got Samba 2.2.x remote buffer overflow. And we've got one down here, which I love to see. This is Rapid 7. So let's go to Rapid 7 first. Why do I like to see Rapid 7? Well, Rapid 7 makes Metasploit. So it looks like this exploit is called Samba trans2 open. And let's read a little bit about the description. So it says, this exploits the buffer overflow found in Samba versions 2.2.0 to 2.2.8. That meets our criteria. This particular module is capable of exploiting the flaw in x86 Linux systems, that's important to know, that do not have the no exec stack option set. Note, some older versions of Red Hat do not seem to be vulnerable since they apparently do not allow anonymous access to IPC. So remember, we did get anonymous access to IPC earlier when we connected to it via our SMB client. We never got access to admin. We could never do anything in IPC. We tried to say ls and it said denied, but we still logged in. So we do have anonymous access to IPC. That's interesting. And we are potentially running against an x86 Linux system, so that's interesting as well. It looks like we're potentially meeting some of the requirements here. Now, here is where this is great. You scroll down here and you see module options. And look, this is Metasploit. It gives you the module options. It says, hey, use exploit Linux Samba trans2 open. And then it tells you, hey, how to do this. And then you're good to go. That's really nice. I really like that. So I'm going to copy this one. And we'll just come to our notes and we'll say something like 139, potentially vulnerable to trans2 open, and we'll just paste the link here. And we can come read these as well. So this is the trans2 open overflow here. This looks like the manual version of the trans2 open overflow. It looks like it is a Perl script. And again, it looks like an overflow. So you'll learn to read these and see what they look like just over time. But you just want to look at the code, make sure everything's good to go. You will need to run this with Perl. It gives you the options here, trans to root Perl, what option to select, what target type to select, your IP address, and your target IP address. So we'll save this one as well, why not? And we'll take a look at the other one, just see what it is. And it looks like it could work for us, remote root exploit for Samba 2.2.x that works against all Linux distributions. Samba.c. I think this is a possibility as well. So this is C code here. We're going to go ahead and just copy this. And we'll go ahead and add this to our list as well. And we'll figure it out. So all we're doing right now is the research. Okay, so from here, I've showed you the Google way. Let's say for some reason you want to do this on the fly, you want to use another tool, or you're in a network and the network has no access. You have no internet access out. You have no research capabilities. You can go to the terminal, and there's a great way to research this as well. So let's go back up to our notes and take a peek. Now let's take this Unix Samba 2.2.1a, for example. And let's do a tool called SearchSploit. Now SearchSploit is going to search for the exploit database, this whole database here that we're looking through. It's brought down onto your machine. Every time you update your machine and the database updates, it updates down your machine and all those exploits get downloaded for you already. But you could say SearchSploit, and maybe we search something like Samba 2.2.1a. Let's see what happens. No results. Well, okay. Why is that? Well, let's delete this. Now, you cannot be too specific with search exploit. The more specific you are, the worse off you are, because search exploit is searching the exact string that you are using. Now, you see that we search Samba, and it's searching for Samba and a 2. Okay, now we can start to see some things here. We see a Linux remote code execution right here, and we're gonna have to look through these. Now, it's not pretty, right? It's not the prettiest, but you see the trans2open does show up. Now, it's not the easiest way. I do prefer Google, but if you're in a pinch or you wanna look at all the different possibilities and see maybe, hey, is there a 2.2 in here? So like, look, Samba 2.2.0 to 2.2.8, OS X, that's not our operating system, but it's called trans2open. And we see that over and over and over again. So maybe the wheels spin again and it says, hey, trans2open, I think that that's potentially what we're looking for here. And then once we get down to the 3s, we know, hey, we've gone too far, this is not our version, etc. We could do the same thing with, let's say, the mod SSL, and we can say something like mod SSL2 if I type search exploit in front of it and do some searching there. And we can see, okay, there's denial of service, not it, 2.8.x, potentially, right? And then mod SSL 2.8.7. And another thing to look at over here, denial of service, remote. Remote is huge. Remote means remote code execution. So learning to read these as well. Exploit, check. Unix, okay, we're running on Linux, check. Remote code execution, check. And Apache mod SSL less than 2.8.7, check. So there's 3 different versions of this, and this is kind of why when I said earlier that, you know, they don't really work. One's been broken, they've rebuilt it. I just like the one off GitHub. So we'll play around with that one in just a little bit. But this is what you're doing. You're either going out to Google with the information that you find, or you're going to search exploit. You're just doing research. So now we've identified a couple potential vulnerabilities, and we can go from there. So what I encourage you to do is just do some research on this Webalizer, do some research on OpenSSH, see what you can find out just for research sake. Practice with search exploit, practice with Google, and then meet me in the next video. So what I want to do before we get into exploitation, I want to give you a quick sneak peek at what your notes should look like so far, so you can see what good note keeping is. And this is in terms of an assessment, okay? Just in terms of an assessment. And then from there, we're going to practice with some other scanning tools just to get you familiar with other things than using just Nmap. And then finally, we'll move into our exploitation. So I will see you in the next video when we look quickly at our notes. Now looking at our assessment notes so far. So you can make this however you want to make it. Whatever makes sense for you is how you should do this. Now this is just a basic example of how I might take notes on an assessment. Now this is just one machine. You might be scanning against hundreds of machines sometimes, and that's okay. You just make the notes against the machines and what findings you have. So for example here, I've got this machine and it's all under this one tab. And we've got some Nmap results. And then on the Nmap results, we've got the different ports that I found open. I did leave off the RPCs, but we can see our Nmap full results here. We can see, okay, on 22, I found OpenSSH. On 80, here's some interesting items I may have had. You know, again, this is just from our notes. Looks familiar. And then I put in the Nikto scan under here. And on 139, I've got the Samba here. And this is just notes for us. Again, could anonymously connect to IPC with SMB client, but not admin. Your client is never going to see these. So make sure you make good notes for yourself, how you can understand it. And importantly, make sure that if somebody goes through here, they can also understand it, because sometimes somebody else might need to go through your report or through your notes, or somebody might be helping you write your report. And it's important to be clear and concise with what you're doing. Now I've got an exploitation tab here. We have not exploited anything yet, but I do have a findings tab here as well. So we've got a couple findings already. We've got this wonderful default test page, and it's hard to see because I've got it on my screen that's blown up, but you saw it once, and make sure that you have the IP address or the host name in your pictures. That's important. And then information disclosure here with the 404 page, and we've got the server header information disclosure. Now these are both taken in GreenShot, and a couple things to point out just for details. I've got borders added around these, and I've highlighted where exactly the finding is. Okay, so it's best to point out, because if these screenshots are going in a report, it's best to find out and just point out to the client exactly where it is, where they need to be looking. And again, make sure you have your identifier here if you can have it. And then here is a response from the website, and again with the information disclosure. So that's just a quick example of how your notes should start to form and how they should look. And then we'll do another one after the initial exploitation to kind of show how we exploited this machine and how we might take some notes for the client as well. And then you'll get to see this all over again in the sample report when we cover report writing towards the end of the course. So that's it, just a quick lesson just to make sure you're still keeping up with your notes. I'm going to harp on this throughout because it's very, very important. So I will catch you in the next videos, next little mini chapter on some additional scanning tools, and we'll get right into exploitation. Now it's time to play around with Nessus. So when it comes to Nessus, Nessus is what is called a vulnerability scanner. You're going to use this quite frequently when you work as a penetration tester / ethical hacker. Basically, let's say you're doing an external assessment. Chances are that you're going to use Nessus in that assessment. Probably even right away, you might kick off your scans. Basically, you're going to send out an email saying, hey, scans are about to start. And then you're going to start your scans, and then you're going to let those scans run. And while you let those scans run, they take some time. You're going to go out and do your information gathering, maybe look for those breach credentials, try to find something juicy on the client. Then you'll come back and you'll review your scan results and see if there's anything interesting there. Same thing with internal. The process really doesn't change. We use Nessus quite a bit. So we're going to use Nessus here and just see what it looks like and how we can use it to our advantage. So let's go ahead and just go out to Google, and we're going to Google Nessus download. And we're going to go to downloads right here from Tenable. Actually, we'll download Nessus right here, sorry. And up at the top, we are looking for 64-bit Debian. So it says Ubuntu, but we're just looking for the Debian. So we're going to go ahead and just click on that and download it. We'll agree. We won't even read it. And we'll save here. And this will take a minute or so to download depending on your connection speed. So if you need to pause, go ahead and pause. Now we're going to open up a terminal, and I'll make this a little bit bigger. And I'm going to CD over to my downloads folder because that's where it is. And then we're going to say dpkg, which is dpackage. And we're going to install with a -i. And we're just going to say Nessus. There we go. Just tab if you have nothing in there. Capital N on the Nessus, and it should autocomplete. And then we'll hit enter. And it's going to grab the package and then start to download it here and install it. And you can see automatically it has been installed. So it says you can start Nessus Scanner by typing /etc init d nessus d start. We're just going to copy that and paste it. And then we're going to navigate to this Kali 443-8834. I cannot talk. And then you're going to see your connection's not secure. We're just going to say advanced, add exception, confirm. And here's Nessus. Now this is going to compile plugins here. So this is going to take some time. Go ahead and let this finish. And when it does, go ahead and say, we're going to download or install Nessus Essentials. Okay, and then you're going to provide it with your name, and you need a valid email for an activation code. All right. Once your activation code has arrived via email, go ahead and just copy paste and then hit continue. And then it's going to ask you for a username. So I'm just going to say H Adams for me, and then I'll just do password 123 because you know I'm super secure. And I'm not going to save, and then now it's going to take a minute. So just go ahead and pause your video, let this install, go get a drink, go get some coffee, whatever it is that makes you happy. And once your Nessus is installed and you are at a login screen, go ahead and log in and then come back to the video and we'll start from there. Whew, that took forever. All right, so we have loaded Nessus, it's installed, and now we're brought to this blank screen that says My Scans. Why is it blank? Well, it's blank because we haven't made a scan yet. So let's go ahead and go up to New Scan. And let's quickly talk about what we're capable of doing. So this is the free edition of Nessus. This means that we can scan against any private IP address, and we can scan up to 16 of those, I do believe, at one time. So remember back to the networking section of your Class A through Class C. That's what we're capable of scanning here. If you were to try to go out and scan a website or an external host, not going to happen. So we do have a couple options here. We're going to start with this basic network scan, and then we'll talk a little bit about the advanced scan. So let's go ahead and click on this basic network here. And what we can do is we can just type in something like Chioptrix for the name, and then I just always copy this because you need a description. I just like to paste it in the description as well. And then down here, it's going to say, hey, what targets do you want to scan against? Well, we're only going to provide one IP address, and that is the IP of Chioptrix. And then let's go with the tabs here on the side. We've got the schedule tab. Schedule sounds exactly what it sounds like. It's scheduling. So let's say that you are into automation and you're working as a pen tester and it's a Monday morning at 8. Maybe you want to sleep in just a little bit longer. And you say, hey, you know what? I got to email a client. I'll schedule that. Email will go out at 8 o'clock. And then the email is going to say, hey, we're kicking off scans right now. And at 8:01, maybe your scan can kick off and you can schedule that to happen. And then you can wake up a little late. Pro tips there. Also, you can enable scanning for once, daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. So if you're in a business, you can do this on a periodic basis and get updated scan results. There's also notifications via SMTP if you have an SMTP server. Most importantly, discovery. So it's going to do port scan of common ports here. I actually like to do port scan of all ports. Again, this is the same thing as like a -P versus a -P-. You see the 1 through 65,535 here, where we come down. Just common ports, I'm guessing top 1,000. So let's go down into assessment and we see scan type default. So we can scan default, we can scan for web vulnerabilities, we can scan for all web and all web complex. Let's just scan for known web vulnerabilities. If we go into complex, it's going to take a while. And this just depends on how deep into the scan you want to go. But we're just going to say for now, scan for known web vulnerabilities. And it'll show what it's going to do. It's going to do some page crawling, do some directory traversing, and look for vulnerabilities. Okay, on the report, it's going to say, hey, can we edit scan results? Yes, we can. Should we display hosts that respond to ping, display unreachable hosts? I just leave this as default most of the time. And then on the advanced tab, we have scan type. I just like to say default here. So we'll save this and then we'll go ahead and just launch it. And you'll see the wheel start spinning and now it means we're running, and this is going to take some time. So while this is going on, let's go ahead and hit new scan up here. And let's look at this as well. So we've got the advanced scan and they've got other scans here, which I don't use a lot of, but you might have used them in the past if you're familiar with Nessus, or they've got little one-offs, like they've got this shell shock detection, and it looks like they've got the shadow brokers detection here. So they've got a couple different scans, even a malware scan, but we're gonna go into advanced scan. These are the most common two you'll be using. Same deal here. And when we go into discovery, you see the discovery is a little bit different. So we've got host scanning, and it says, hey, do you want to ping the host? Or maybe you don't want to ping the host. And if we do ping the host, what are we looking for? Are we looking for ARP, TCP, ICMP, or UDP? What do we want to scan? Do we want to scan network printers? If we're doing an internal network assessment, maybe we want to click that. Maybe not, you know? And we can do a different types of scanning here. There's a lot more options, which is what advanced scanning is for. We could do port scanning. You see the SYN scan comes up again, aka stealth scanning. We could do UDP, and even down here it says it's really not possible for UDP to pick up between open and filtered ports. So UDP scanning takes forever, and it's not always reliable. We could do service discovery. I kind of just leave these blank or leave them as default. And then when we come through assessment, same thing. It just gives us additional options here. So it's always good to click through these. Do we want to brute force any logins? We could use Hydra to do brute forcing if we want. We could test for default accounts on if we could discover like an Oracle database, etc. But this is going to go through and try empty passwords, try login as password, etc. So this just does a little bit more here. We can scan web applications and we can say, hey, we want to use a specific user agent, or we want to crawl from a certain web page. How many pages are we going to crawl? Again, it just gives us more control. So if we come down here, reporting looks the same, and then advanced, we have a little bit of more options here as well. But again, either way, if you use the advanced scan, I would start with the basic scan just as a beginner and then kind of play around with the advanced scan and see if you can scan against the same host and maybe get back more information. And maybe key objects is a good one to play with. But let's go ahead and go over to credentials. And now if you had credentials for a machine and you wanted to like log into that machine via SSH or Windows or even SNMP, you could enter in credentials and you could scan a little bit deeper on the machine, but you're likely never going to get that as a pen tester because you usually don't have any access. So let's go back to our scans, and you see now that it's scanning and running. The nice thing is that it does update vulnerabilities as it finds them, and it is finding them. We're actually at 99% right now. So you can click in it and you can see that it's got all different kind of vulnerabilities, and right now they're kind of grouped. So we won't worry about them too much. We're going to ungroup this once it's done. So I tell you what, go ahead and let your scan finish. Once your scan's finished, I'm going to meet you over in the next video, which is going to be part 2, where we're going to look at the scan results, talk about them a little bit, and see what Nessus can do for us. Now on to part 2. Our scan results are done, and we can tell because we've got a nice check mark here that says complete. So we're just going to click into our scan results. And looking at the overview, we can see here that we've got 5 critical, 38 highs, 59 mediums, 10 lows, and 67 informational. So we're going to click on the vulnerabilities here, and let me make this bigger. So what we're going to do is we're going to just take a peek at this. And this new version of Nessus actually starts grouping these together. Let's go ahead and hit settings and disable groups. And that'll show us by severity. So look what's coming back up. OpenSSL, unsupported. Let's check it out. 0.9.6b, 1.1.0, and it's saying, according to the banner, the remote server is running OpenSSL. And it doesn't tell us much about it. We'd actually have to do a little bit of research, click into this, see why this is such a bad thing, but this is absolutely out of date. Okay, so if we're making a screenshot here, we're gonna say, hey, this is out of date. We see this installed version. It's recommended to patch to this version. So if you're taking notes, you can go ahead and add that into your notes for your vulnerabilities. This is insufficient patching. Come back through here. It says even OpenSSH has remote privilege escalation. It's got remote overflows. So it looks like you could possibly perform an overflow against SSH. So if you did some research and you were able to find a vulnerability with that, that's cool. And we come through here and you see the Apache has denial of service, cross-site scripting. Again, Apache looks like insufficient patching, and mod SSL shows up, OpenSSL shows up. And I mean, we've just got vulnerability after vulnerability. So we would write a lot of these up, and depending on the assessment and how the assessment was going, depends on the severity that we're going to write up. Now, if we find remote code execution, we get a lot of access to a client, and a client just lights up like a Christmas tree when it comes time to reviewing their scans, then a lot of these, we might report on a lot of these, and we might not report on a lot of the lows or a lot of the mediums. But if we're in the opposite situation where, we aren't finding a lot, but there's still stuff to report, then we might report on like, hey, OpenSSL is, it's out of date. And then we go to the next page and we find a low, and maybe there's like, okay, there's something in here that's related to SSL TLS. This one is an unsupported cipher. We might report that as well, just depending on the potential in how many vulnerabilities that there actually are. So as of right now, it looks like this box is pretty critical. But what we also do as penetration testers is we take all the results in front of us, and what we'll do is we'll come in and we'll download this Nessus file. We'll take that Nessus file, and there's tools out there to convert a Nessus file into an Excel document, and it makes it nice and pretty, and we'll hand that over to the client as well. And in the report, it'll say, hey, look, we've covered some of the vulnerabilities. There's no way for us to touch all of them because this is a timed assessment. We focused on the low-hanging fruit. We focused on what we could. So please do go look at your Nessus scan results and all the information that we provide to you because it's super important. So again, if we have a client like this where we're going to have remote code execution, we're going to have a lot of vulnerabilities, then these things just start to stack up. And this is what a Nessus result looks like. You can click into these, you can get more information and possibly even, details on how to exploit it and how to solve it as well. So there's useful links in here a lot of the times, and just they give you information, but you should always go out and verify. Never trust your vulnerability scanner. Just because it says, hey, we detected it, you should go out and look and find it. Just like we had that screenshot from before with the Apache service version, we know this exists. We wouldn't provide a screenshot of the output of Nessus. We would go provide a screenshot that says, hey, we actually proved that we know it's there and you're out of date. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're doing with Nessus and why we're using it and how it could be an advantage to us. Sometimes we're so overwhelmed with everything around us that we might miss some vulnerabilities. And it's nice to just have a scanner detect a lot of vulnerabilities just for us. And it gives us something to look through, something to verify, double check, etc. It's just an extra layer of vulnerability assessment for us. It's a friend in the game. So I own 2 programs as a pen tester, 2 programs that I pay for. Nessus license is one, Burp Suite Pro is the other. So that's it for this section. Now we're going to move on to exploitation, really start to get into the fun stuff, talk about some different exploitation techniques you're going to see, and then we'll do a bunch of box walkthroughs and get into exploit development, and it's about to get so fun. This is the fun part of the course. Up until this point, it's just been scanning, enumeration, learning about the process, and it's been 9 hours of course material so far, or almost 8 hours of course material, just to get to this point. That's how important I think that information gathering and scanning enumeration are, along with the foundations and the materials. You need to know all that before you can just start exploiting machines. So now we're there. Congratulations, pat yourself on the back. We're almost halfway through the exploitation part of this course. So once we get to the middle of the course capstone, I think it's going to be really fun and exciting. So that's it. End of spiel. I'll see you over in the next section when we start learning exploitation. Before we could start the cool exploitation phase, we have to first define a couple things. So we're going to quickly define different shell types we're going to see, and then we're going to define different types of payloads we're going to see. So let's first start with the shells. The most common shell you're going to see is what is called a reverse shell. Now in this example, it is using a tool called Netcat, which you're going to see here shortly. And a shell, all a shell is access to a machine. So when we say we pop a shell, that means we get access to a machine. Now a reverse shell means that a victim connects to us. Here you see it says target connecting to attack box, and you may get asked this question about shells in an interview. What is a reverse shell? What is a bind shell? So a reverse shell means, again, a victim connects to us. You see that it says target is connecting, attack box is listening. So what's happening here is that on the attack box, you can see that we have netcat. This is NC, and we're just listening on a port here. LVP means listening verbose port. So we're listening on port 4444. That means on our machine, we're opening up that port when we use netcat. On this machine, it's going to say, hey, netcat, I want to connect to this IP address here. I want to connect to it on port 4444. And when I do that, I'm going to establish this bin shell here. So I'm going to execute bin shell, which is a Linux machine. If this was Windows, then it would be command.exe. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, let's connect over here, and this is going to connect. So all we're going to do with the reverse shell is we're going to listen. Now, with the bind shell, a little bit different. We have our attack box and then our target. So with the bind shell, we actually open up a port on the machine, then we connect to it. So we fire off an exploit, that exploit goes in and it opens up a port, and then it's listening for us to connect. When we connect on that specific port to that specific machine with netcat, then we're going to go ahead and get that shell, and on this side, it's going to execute for us that bin sh. Now, if we go back, same thing here. We're going to send some sort of exploit that's going to talk back and say, hey, I want to, when you exploit this, go ahead and just connect to 4444 on this machine. Now, this is going to come together very clearly when we get into our exploit development part here in just a little bit. But all you need to know right now is that a reverse shell means the target connects back to us. A bind shell means we connect to the target. Now, a little bit more about reverse shells. You're going to use reverse shells 95% of the time. There are instances where you're going to use bind shells. Bind shells most likely are going to be on an external assessment. If you think about it, a reverse shell, you're sitting in your home network and you are sitting on a VM, and that VM is using an internal IP address. It's talking out through NAT. It's going through your public IP address and you're attacking a target. Well, how are you going to connect that public IP address of the target back to yourself on an internal IP? You're going to have to set a port forward or a port trigger on your firewall to talk into that specific machine. It's a little bit of extra work. You're opening some stuff up on your side. The other idea is to say, hey, bind shell, why don't I just go ahead and open a port up on that target? I'll NAT my way through on my public IP address and I'll just connect to that port. It doesn't care what IP address you're coming from. You see, it's just listening. So we can come from any IP address and connect to that port on that machine. So this is where bind shells are useful when we have to bypass some sort of firewall, or it just makes sense. Sometimes a reverse shell just doesn't work and we have to use a bind shell anyway. So we have to think about the connection and how it's getting to and from us. Most of the time, especially because you're going to practice a lot in labs and you're going to do internal assessments as well, most of your shells are going to come in the form of reverse shell. However, bind shells do exist and you should know what they are as well. And again, for an interview, you should know the difference. So before we finish here, let's go ahead and take a look at what these look like. And I'm going to log back into my machine. And I've got two things open here. I've got 1 and 2. We're going to play victim and we're going to play target, right? Or attacker. So on the attacker, if we have a reverse shell, we're just going to say netcat, I want to listen. And I like to do NVLP, but you can do LVP as well, VLP. It doesn't matter what order. I just do the NVLP and all fours. So now we're listening on any, on all fours, right? So here we're going to say, on the victim screen, we're going to say, hey, netcat, I want to connect, and this is a self connection, but still, I want to connect to the victim machine, or I want to connect to my attacker from the victim machine, and our attacker's IP address is 139. They've got 4444 open. Let's establish that connection, and we're going to offer them bin bash when we do. And here's that connection. So this is a reverse shell. We were listening as the attacker, and then the victim connected to us, and then we could say something like, who am I? And you could see root, and then host name, Cali, and we have a connection, and we offered up that bin bash here, so that works. So that is an example of a reverse shell. So I'm gonna control C this connection, kill it, it dies over here. Now, let's say we wanted to flip the script and we want a bind shell. Well, now, guess who needs to be listening? Now in this instance, we're going to be listening and we're going to be offering up the bin bash because we are the victim. Okay, so we still have to offer up whatever command line we are going to have here. Now, all we have to do as the attacker is connect to our victim, and we have the same connection. You see the connection happens here. Who am I? Root, hostname, Cali. So That is the difference between a bind shell and a reverse shell. Remember, reverse shells are most commonly used, but bind shells are important. Again, just to hammer it home, reverse shell means a victim connects to us. Bind shell means we connect to a victim. So I'll catch you over in the next video when we talk about staged versus non-staged payloads. Now let's talk about staged versus non-staged payloads. And before we do that, we must talk about a payload. So a payload is what we're going to run as an exploit. And when we run that exploit, it's called a payload. We use different types of payloads depending on what it is. So you might see a Windows type payload or a Linux type payload, or as you see on the screen, interpreter type payload. There's Python. There's all different types. There's like 500 and something that we saw in Metasploit alone. And these payloads are what we use to send to a victim and attempt to get a shell on the machine. Now, it's going to make more sense as we go. It's okay if you're still a little bit confused on all of this. There are two main types of payloads that we need to pay attention to. There is what we call non-staged and what we call staged. Now, a non-staged payload sends the exploit shellcode all at once, where a staged payload sends it in stages. The non-staged payload is larger in size and it doesn't always work, where the staged payload can actually be less stable. So each has its con. And we have an example of it, and this is really what I want to point out, is we have this non-staged payload and we have a staged payload. And do you see the one difference between the two? All it is a /. So when we see these and we're using something like Metasploit and we have to pick out a payload, if we see something like interpreter _reverse _TCP, this identifies that this is a non-staged payload. We can ignore the windows here. But here where we see interpreter /reverse _TCP, this means we have a staged payload. What's happening? It's saying, hey, stage 1, stage 2. What's happening here? It's saying, hey, let's send this all at once. So this is going to become very important very quick, as we will attempt an exploit here very soon and it's not going to work. And then we're going to change the payload and it's going to work beautifully. So understand that the takeaway is, if you have a payload that does not work, maybe try the other type of that payload. If you see something like reverse TCP, which is a reverse shell, by the way, over a TCP connection, if you say, hey, I'm going to send this stage reverse TCP, it's not working. All right, let me try to send a non-staged reverse TCP. Okay, that's not working, but I'm sure my exploit's right. So maybe I send a bind shell instead of a reverse shell here, and I'll send a bind shell staged and then non-staged. And we just keep trying until we find a payload that works. Not every payload is the right payload, and we have to find the one that works for us. So the takeaways: remember the /, remember the slight differences between non-stage and stage, and remember, if your payload fails but you think it's the right exploit, maybe change your payload. So we'll see that here very shortly as we start to get into exploitation in the next few videos. Whew, I am excited. And let me tell you how excited I am. This is not the first time I've recorded this video. This is actually the second time recording this video, because the first time I forgot to hit the record button. So now it's blinking red right in front of me, guaranteed recording. And I'm still as excited. Even the second time walking through this, I'm still as excited, because this is what we've been building up for. This is everything we've been doing. The scanning, the enumeration, even the Linux and the Python. This is all building up to this. And now we're ready to exploit. We're going to get our first shell. We're going to pop our first shell today. And I'm so excited for both of us. So what we're going to do is we're going to run Metasploit for this one. And Metasploit's a little bit automated, but that's okay. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and cover it manually. So what we're going to do is we're going to attack SMB here. And with SMB, what we're going to do is, if you don't remember, search exploit Samba 2.2. We found Samba 2.2.1a. We searched around. We went out to the interwebs. We did search exploit. And we kept seeing this trans to open show up, like here and here, 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 all down here, right? Repeatedly. And it meets the criteria. Everything seems to make sense. It had that IPC anonymous connection as well. So I think this is a winner. And we're going to go ahead and give it a try. So I'm going to copy this, and we're just going to go ahead and type in MSF console and load up Metasploit. Once Metasploit loads, we're going to go ahead and just search for this guy and see if we can't find it. Now we know it exists because we did find that handy dandy Rapid7 website that said it did. So we're going to search it here, and we're given 4 options. Now, these are all operating systems here, but we have been good enumerators and good investigators, researchers, information gatherers, etc. We could have willy-nilly just saw 139, said, hey, I'm going to try to find exploits against it, and never looked at any other ports, but that's not us. We went out to port 80, we saw that it was running Red Hat, we discovered Linux on the machine, so we know we're going to pick the Linux module. So we're going to say use 1 as that corresponds to this module here, and then we're going to type in options. And all we have to do is set a R host. So remember, R host stands for remote host, or the victim that we're attacking. So we're going to say set R host and 192.168.5.7.134. And we're going to say options one more time, make sure that that actually set in there, and it did. Now, one thing I like to do is type in show targets. Now, there are no targets here, but as you're going to see later on in the course, there are often targets that we have to pick from. Not always is the first choice that's auto-selected right for us, but in this instance, there's only one choice, so it's the right choice. So now we have 2 options. Both are going to do the same thing for us. We can type in run, or we can type in exploit. If we want to be cool, I want to be cool, let's type in exploit. So we're going to run this, and it's going to start this brute force attack here, and it's going to start opening shells and closing shells. What is going on? So let's Control C. If yours is doing this, go ahead and Control C, interrupt this. Let's talk about what's happening. So you see it's trying this brute force attack. It's trying different return addresses here, and finally it lands on one that works, and it says, hey, I'm going to send this stage. This is always a good sign, by the way, sending the stage. Then it says, hey, I've got this Meterpreter session open because our payload has worked. And then this Meterpreter session closed. Reason died. That's not good. So it keeps going through over and over and over and over, and it's just dying. What is going on? Well, we've talked about this. Let's go into options again. Now, you don't see this the first time you do it, but you see it the second time because Metasploit says, hey, if your payload's not working, maybe the payload's the issue. And I'm going to give you payload options this time around. Now we see payload options here in the middle. That wasn't there before. We can see that we're running Linux x86 Meterpreter /reverse_TCP. What does that mean? Well, that means that we are running a staged payload. Couple other things to note while we're in here. We see lhost. That is the opposite of our host. Lhost is us. We are the listening host. So we sit here and we have our IP address. Sometimes this auto selects correctly, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, it did. And then we have the L port, which is by default, all 4s. So that's fine for now. It's fine for these lessons. When you get into actually running this in the wild, all 4s is probably going to get you picked up pretty quick because this is a default Meterpreter port. So if some connection sees or some antivirus or detection software sees 4444 open up, this is going to trigger an alarm here. But anyway, for this course, you're not going to need to worry about it too much. Right now, we're going to go ahead and set a payload. We're going to say set payload. And how do we know what payload to pick? Let's just start typing out Linux and hit tab. And it auto tabs out the x86 part for us. And then let's just hit double tab. All right, now with double tab, that's great. Look at the payload options we have. We've got a bunch. Now, we've got a bunch of Meterpreters, but unfortunately, they're all staged payloads here. I love a good Meterpreter shell, and you guys will understand why as we move forward. But as of right now, it doesn't look like we're going to be able to use one. If we come over to this right column here, you can see that we've got other shells as well, And we come down, and finally down here, we've got a few options that are non-staged. So let's go ahead and try this shell reverse underscore TCP right here. And you can just start typing that out. And that should auto tab complete for you. Go ahead and hit enter. Hit options one more time to make sure that this actually works. You can see here that it actually picked up. And now let's go ahead and try to run this. And let's see if it happens. Fingers crossed. Hey, look at that. So we've got a shell now. And it says command shell session open 5. Let's try, who am I? Root, hostname, Captrix level 1. We have successfully rooted this machine. Root is the commander of the system. We cannot go any deeper than this. We own this machine. Hands down, it's our machine. So congratulations. You have made it this far. This is your first rooted machine. You should be very proud. Pat yourself on the back. You're awesome. So from here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to focus on port 80 and 443 and how we can exploit those manually. And then we'll move on to some other exploitation techniques. But for now, congratulate yourself. You have your first shell. I'm very excited for you. So I'll catch you over in the next video as we start some manual exploitation. So we have gained root with Metasploit, but now we need to gain root with some manual exploitation. So remember earlier we discovered that we had an exploit with our mod SSL, and we're going to see what we could do about it. So we went to Google and we researched mod SSL and we came up with something called Open Luck, if you remember that. So we clicked on this Open Luck here, and this is the same as the one that is out there on exploit database, but it is fixed. So remember the exploit database one is broken, so we'd rather use this one that is fixed. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow the instructions here. And this is very well laid out. So it tells you to git clone this, we need to do an install of an SSL dev library, we need to compile and then run the exploit. So very, very straightforward. We're going to go ahead and do exactly what it says. And let's go ahead and just copy this first line here. And I'm going to just make this a little smaller, go into a terminal. And I actually have a folder for Captrix. I'm going to cd into it. And then we're going to go ahead and just paste that line. And it will git clone everything. If we ls, now we see that it is there. So let's cd into that folder, the bad word folder, and we'll ls. And now you can see that there is just the C file here in the README. So what we're going to do is we need to install this libssl dev. So we're going to say apt install and then libssl-dev like this, hit enter, and then just hit enter because it says yes already. This will take just a second to install. And then once it does this, we're going to use a tool, looks like, called GCC, which GCC is a compiler. So if you've never used C or are familiar with C, we have a C file, but this isn't ready to use. We have to compile that C file in order to actually use it. So that's what we're doing here, is we're downloading a little bit of stuff to actually be able to compile that. GCC is built in, and we just needed some other things additionally. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say GCC, and typically you say -o for the output, so we can call it whatever we want. We'll just call this open, and then we'll just specify the file. You can start typing it and then tab out. And then it says this L crypto, which is important. Hit enter, okay, and then hit ls. And you see now in pretty green lighting up and saying, hey, we're executable. We have our executable, right? We have our script that we can run. So we could say /open and run it. And you can see in here all the different options that this runs against. So you remember when it was brute forcing, the last one, when we saw the trans to open was kind of doing brute force. In theory, this is what it could do as well, but here we actually have to pick a return address based on our machine. So We're going to look at the usage. I always like to do the application without any usage to see what the usage is. And we need to use target box, which is one of these down here. We need to select a port. Maybe it says for SSL connection. We're not going to be using an SSL connection, so don't worry about that. And then a -C number. And it says use range 40 to 50 if you don't know. So our syntax is going to look something like ./open, one of these offsets that we're going to pick. And then it's going to be a -C, probably 40, with the box IP address in between. So how do we find what we're looking for? Well, I'm going to cheat just a little bit and tell you guys to scroll down, 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 down. And if we look at 6B here, remember, we were up against Apache 1.3.20. See, enumeration comes into play big time. So Apache 1.3.20. Now there are two we can run against. I'm picking this one. I believe it's the more stable one. So we could pick either one, but I would choose B. I think A doesn't work all the time. So let's choose B here. And Apache 1.3.20 is the indicator. And again, Red Hat Linux, so that's another indicator. So let's copy this so we don't forget it. And we're just going to scroll down and we're going to say, hey, ./open, and we're going to paste that 0x6b. And then we're going to run this against the IP address because it said box was next. So 134. And then remember we had to give a -C of 40. So that is the syntax. Sometimes you have to follow along, and it's I don't think most of them are as confusing as this. I don't when you say this is confusing, I would just say it's pretty lengthy for a exploit because you have to go through all the different offsets here to find the offset and actually fire this off. But you have the opportunity here to actually be able to read usage and just understand your way through it. So once you get this little syntax and all this part down, it's really not that bad. So to check off the list, we've got the target, we've got the box IP address. We don't need the port because we're not running against SSL. We're just going to run this against port 80, and then we're going to run -C of 40. So let's go ahead and try to fire that off and see what happens here. And this may just take a second. Okay, it says it's spawning a shell. Now we wait for the SUID. Let's scroll up just a little bit while we're waiting here to see. So it looks like it sent the shell code and it spawned a shell. And it says, hey, we have no job control in this shell. And then it has a shell here, bash 2.05. That is a shell. And then it's going in and it's doing some wgets. Now, if this is able to get out to the internet, it's going to go ahead and try to do wgets against these. It's going to keep downloading and it's going to get the response here. Okay. And now it says we wait for the shell because it saved this .c file here. And let's see if maybe we already have a shell. Who am I? Root. Look at that. So it looks like it downloaded something and allowed us to maybe privilege escalate here. And let's say host name. Okay. So we've gone through and we've rooted this machine with Metasploit, and now we've gone through and rooted this machine with the manually downloaded exploit. So there's two options. You're going to find out that Metasploit is a more robust and popular option, especially as a penetration tester. Now, there is a common misconception or thought process put out there by certifications. The OSCP, for example, doesn't let you use a lot of Metasploit, only one instance of Metasploit on their exam. So everybody thinks, man, I really shouldn't use Metasploit. But you're going to see in this course how useful it really is and how robust it is. And if you talk to a penetration tester, they're going to use the best tools available to them. The certifications out there that do that are just making it harder to pass the exam intentionally than they are, for practicality. This course is all about practicality. So from here, now that we've exploited it manually, let's talk about a couple things that we look for in post. So post being post exploitation, and we're going to cover this over and over and over again. We're not going to get into it fully right now. I just want to give you an idea as to the thought process. So the first thing to think about is, what is our IP address? We could say ifconfig if it'll allow us to. It depends on what kind of shell we're in. And see, this one is a weird shell. We could try IPA. It's still not going to be found. If we try some commands like arp or route, I doubt they're going to be found right now either. But we want to look at like the routing table, the arp table. We want to see if this machine is what's called dual homed. And you're going to learn more about that when we get into the pivoting. But if this has like two NICs, and we're on one network and the NIC is on a second network that we never saw before, then maybe we can do something called pivoting and move into that new network. But we would be able to identify who the machine's talking to with an ARP table or a route. We could also look at like sudo privileges. So we could say something like sudo-l, but we're root, so we can run as everybody. So if a sudo user, as we talked about in Linux lessons, sudo user is able to run commands as elevated, but here as root, we're obviously already elevated. So other things that we can do, we can cat what's called the etc password file. Now this is very misleading because the etc password file used to be the password file. Now it just holds a placeholder. So you could see all the users that are on this computer, root being this one. There's a lot of built-in users here. But if you always scroll down to the bottom and you start at the 500s, that's where your users start. So there's actually two users on this computer as well. One's named John, the other's named Harold. So we look at these users and we say, okay, well, there's no password in this password file, but there used to be. Back in the day, there used to be. That's why they call it this. And now they moved it to this placeholder of an X. And what we can do is we can come in here and we can say, hey, cat etc shadow. And now you see the hashes are in here. So these hashes are what the X is placeholding for. We can actually combine both of these files with the tool and go offline and try to crack these. We'll work on that later on in the course. But just for now, like getting your wheels spinning on as to what we can do with root level access. We need to start enumerating again, looking at files on the computer, seeing what's out there and what we can do with it. But we'll get into post-exploitation techniques and thought process as we go through the Active Directory portion of the course, because I think it plays hand in hand. And we could talk about password cracking there and how to attack some of this stuff. But there will be a password cracking video on Linux as well when we get into the post-exploitation phase of this. But that's really it for now. So we've got the shadow. We could take this offline, try to crack it. We can enumerate files. We can try to, break into user folders and see what they've got in there. Maybe they've got password files stored in there, etc. So from here, we have rooted this machine twice. We've rooted it with Metasploit, we rooted it manually, and now we can start moving on. I do want to show you a few more attacks. So here's what's going to happen over the next few videos. We're going to talk about brute force attacks really quick on SSH. We're going to talk about credential stuffing. We're going to revisit that concept that we talked about in information gathering. And then we're going to look at our notes. And we're just going to compare notes and see where we're at with findings and everything else. After that, we're going to get into what I like to call the mid-course capstone, which is going to allow us to do a bunch of exploitation against a bunch of machines, and it should be really fun. So end of spiel again. I will catch you over in the next video as we talk about brute force attacks. In a previous video, we discussed SSH and that it's really not always that much of a low-hanging fruit. So we've got SSH here, and say we want to attack it. Now there are three reasons we're going to do this, and this is from a realistic perspective. If we see SSH on an assessment, we're going to try to brute force against it or use weak or default credentials. And we're going to do that because, one, we're going to test password strength. Two, we're going to see if we can get in with a weak password or default password. And if we can, that also attests to password strength, correct? And 3, we're going to see how well the blue team performs. Do they catch us? Do they see us brute forcing? This should be something that should alert when it is being performed, but you would be surprised how often it does not. So during a pen test, I am as loud as possible. This is not a red team assessment where we're trying to be quiet. This is a pen test where we are as loud as possible and we are hoping to be caught sometimes, just told to tone it down a little bit. You know, hey, we're seeing you. Can you be more quiet? And we just want to be caught sometimes so we can give kudos in a report and say, hey, you saw us scanning here and here, and kudos to you, but you didn't see us scanning here and here. So this is how we really help fine tune a blue team and help fine tune a client as well, is being loud sometimes. So we're going to practice being loud today, and we're also going to practice brute force attacks. And we have the perfect opportunity to do that with an SSH port being open on this machine. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a tool called Hydra, and then I'll show you the Metasploit way as well. So Hydra is a brute force tool. So the syntax for Hydra is going to be this. We're going to say Hydra, and then we're going to give a -L for the user that we're going to be utilizing. In this case, I want to attack root. And then we're going to give a capital P for the password list. So if we wanted to use a password list with L, we can just say capital L. But here we're going to say capital P for the password list. And then we're just going to say user share wordless Metasploit. And I'm just going to double tab in this folder so you can see how many words are actually in here. There's quite a bit of word lists, and you can space, and it has word lists for all different kinds of things built in, and these are all over Kali, so it's good to know your folder locations, but user share word list is one that we'll use quite a bit. And what we're going to do is we're going to utilize an attack with these Unix passwords here. So we have a Unix users and Unix passwords. We're going to utilize the Unix password list and just try to brute force with that. So we'll say Unix passwords, something like that. And then we're going to need to specify what we're attacking. So we are attacking SSH, like this, and our IP address of our machine that we're attacking on port 22. And then we need to have a certain amount of attempts or threads at once, and we're going to limit that to 4. And then I'm going to do a capital V for verbosity, just because I want to see the user attempts flow through so that we can actually see what's going on here. So once you got the syntax ready to go ahead and hit enter. And you're going to see that it's starting to attempt root login password with all these weak passwords here. And hopefully it might find something. But let's go ahead and open up a new terminal here. And we're going to just make this a little bigger, and I'm going to load up Metasploit as well. And we're going to run the same exact thing in Metasploit, but I think it's good to know multiple frameworks and multiple tools to perform the same task. So here we're going to search for something like SSH, and this is going to be an auxiliary module, so we'll just scroll up, and we're going to look for something like SSH login. Perfect. Login check scanner. And make sure we don't have anything else, and that looks good to me. So let's go ahead and take this SSH login, and we're going to go ahead and say use options, and now we have kind of our brute force options here. Let me make this a little bigger so it's prettier. So we've got a brute force speed from 0 to 5, 5 being the fastest. Try blank passwords, no. We can set a hard password, and we could set a hard username. We could set a user and password file, a user as password file. Again, we can have a password file as well. So we have a lot of different options here that we can utilize. But we're going to go ahead and do the same kind of thing. We're going to say set username, and we're just going to say root. And then we're going to say set pass file, And similar to what we just used, we're going to say user share wordless Metasploit, and then we're going to say Unix passwords, and that should set the pass file. And then we just need an rhost as well. Set rhost, and we'll say 192.168.57.134. Say options one more time. And you can see that we've got our password file set. We've got our rhost set. We've got our rport on 22. Threads is 1, username root, and we should be good to go. Now we could set multiple threads here. We could set threads to like 10. This is really gonna amp it up. I mean, this should be detected in a second, but we're gonna try to run it. And we could set, actually, let me Control C. Let's set verbose to true as well, just so you could see that it's actually working. Set verbose to true, and then we're gonna run this. And then it's going to attempt different credentials here, and it'll say, hey, I found it, and it'll light up green, and then we'll know it's good. So this is actually going kind of slow, surprisingly, and you can see here that we are at attempt 112, 116. So this is also going slow, and we do not have a successful attempt or login. I actually don't believe that there's going to be one, but you never know. I believe I remember taking this offline and trying to crack the password, and it wasn't any kind of weak password. So you can let your brute force run if you want to go with it, but I'm going to go ahead and kill mine. And that's it for this video. So from here, we're going to talk about a similar methodology called credential stuffing, which we've already talked about before, except we're not brute forcing, but we're using common knowledge to our advantage. So we'll talk about a little bit of credential stuffing in the next video. Let's talk again about credential stuffing, and while we're at it, we're going to talk about password spraying. Now, I realize we talked about this earlier in the course with breach parse and WeLeakInfo, but I do think that hammering concepts over and over and how important they are does help for information retention. So again, if we look at this example here, what is credential stuffing? Well, it's just injecting breached account credentials in hopes of account takeover. So if you look at the compromised server here in the upper right-hand corner, we pull down usernames and credentials. And we get these from leaks like the LinkedIn link or the Equifax link or whatever of those have come out recently. We get these leaked credentials. And we grab these databases, we search through them like we did with breach parse or like we can with WeLeakInfo, and we get these stolen credentials. And we take these credentials and we try to pass them to the site login. Now, we could take a look at a real life example of that, which I have pulled up here. And again, this is just an example of the Tesla breach parse. So we have some usernames and passwords. We have repeat offenders, remember? We also have similar passwords here. But the art of credential stuffing is taking these passwords and these usernames and throwing them at a website. That's all it is. So we're going to throw them at a website and just kind of spray and pray. Now, I just gone ahead and opened up this same Tesla-master. I've only opened up the users and the passwords just for an example of spraying. This video is going to be in theory only. I don't want you attacking Tesla's website. So just take this for example. You can follow all the way up until the point that we actually hit attack if you want to follow along. But for this, please do not attempt an exploit against Tesla. You do not know when the criteria is going to change, and I just don't want you getting in trouble just in case it does. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and go to Firefox. And while we are in Firefox, what I want to do is I want to take a quick pit stop and go to Google, and I want to look up something called Foxy Proxy. So go ahead and do this. Look up Foxy Proxy like this, not Froxy, Foxy Proxy. And go ahead and click on this top one here, the standard. And we're just going to go ahead and install the standard to our Firefox. And this is going to be a useful tool that we'll be using throughout the course. So, okay, we've got Foxy Proxy installed. Now what has happened up in the right-hand corner, we've got this here. You can see Foxy Proxies here, and we can just say, hey, options. And in the options, we're going to add in a proxy over here on the left. And we're just going to call it Burp Suite. And then over here, we've got proxy types. We're just going to leave this at HTTP. And then we're going to give it an address, which is 127.0.0.1. Same thing as before. And again, this is 8080. We'll just hit save. And then we're going to go ahead and close out. And then all we got to do now is click this and click this. And now Burp Suite's turned on. Super simple. So let's go ahead also to our applications. And let's just go up here and open up Burp Suite. And let's test out our proxy and make sure. Ignore the errors. Don't worry about those. We'll just go ahead and hit next and use burp defaults. And I will give you a second here to catch up because I realize that I might be clicking through a little fast. So once you have everything set up like this, what we're going to do is we're just going to make sure our proxy works. So I'm just going to refresh the page and you can see that it worked. So easy on, easy off. That's all we're looking for here. Instead of having to go in the menu and go to preferences and, go through that whole process, all we got to do is click a little button. We can turn it on or off within a couple clicks. So from here, I'm going to turn the intercept off. And we're just going to go ahead and go to tesla.com. And Tesla should look like this when you go to it. In the upper right-hand corner, there is a sign in button. Go ahead and click sign in. And again, this is just a watch and learn exercise. You can follow along up until the point that we fire the attack. There will be opportunities here in very, very soon videos where you actually get to do this and you can practice along. So from here, let's turn on the intercept and let's go ahead and just put a fake email. We'll just do test@test.com and we'll do test as the password and hit sign in. And that intercepts here. So you can see the user equals, or email equals test@test.com and password equals test. We're going to go ahead and just right click this and say send to intruder. And from intruder, what we're going to do is we're going to go to positions in here and then we're going to clear it. All those green go away because it tries to auto select positions for us. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to highlight this here and we're going to say add. And then we're going to highlight this here, and we're going to say add. So we're selecting two different parameters. We're selecting the email parameter, and we're selecting the password parameter. And now we have different attack types up here. The most common that we're going to use is either sniper, but sniper uses one parameter. So we're actually going to use what is called a pitchfork here. And we're going to go ahead and go over to our payloads. And what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is I'm going to take this list of users and I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to paste it. And then on the second one, I'm going to take my list of passwords and I'm going to paste it. Now, what this is doing, if we go back, payload set 1 is all the usernames. It's going into the first one we set here. Payload set 2, all the passwords. Those are all going into here. And we have 30 total counts, meaning what's happening with this pitchfork is payload 1, number 1, is corresponding to payload 2, number 1. So they only run together. So this will run the username and password. These are just the separated users and passwords. This will run this username against this password here. So what we're going to do is just we start an attack and it just says, hey, this is a demo version of intruder because you're on community. Don't worry about that. It still runs. It's just a little slower. I'm going to go ahead and hit pause on the attack. Now there are some interesting things that we can look for. When we're doing this, what we're looking for is a status code change of some sort. Maybe we see 200s here and we want like a 301, which means a redirect. Or we see a significant change in length. That would be a good indicator that maybe we had a successful login. Other items too is that we can click in here and look at the response. And we can say, okay, what did the response say? And if we scroll down, maybe it said something in here about fail login. Okay, we could not sign you in. And we could just take, we could not sign you in like this, copy this, and then we can come back, we'll close this attack. We'll come into options here, and there's actually a grep feature. So we can clear all these in this little box, and we can just paste this and say, yes, match this here. So watch what this does. So we're gonna start this attack again, and then I'm gonna pause it. And you can know immediately, look at the checkboxes. This means it's showing up in the response, it's grepping it out, it knows immediately that we didn't sign in successfully. So this is an example of a credential stuffing attack. So we're looking for these few different things, a status change, a significant length. Like we're seeing all the same kind of lengths here, but what if it was like 5,000 or 2,000 or 15,000? If the page length changes, there's a good chance that you signed into something and we have a successful login. Same thing here with this. If you can find your error code or what it says and then grep on that, then you can click up here and just sort by that. And you can search for the ones that don't return that and possibly have a login as well. So this is the art of credential stuffing. Now, let's say we wanted to close this out. We want to go back and we want to do password spraying. Well, we're going to go ahead and just clear this out. And if you remember, password spraying is the art of using known usernames without a known password. So we'll just say add here, and we would gather a list of all the possible users that we can think of. We can look at hunter.io, we can look at, the breach password list, we can look at LinkedIn and gather people who work there, come up with this big list, and then actually clear, sorry. No, this is right. We'll add these and we'll have all the different users. And then for this, we'll just change the request to like fall of 2019. Or we can set it up to, we could set this up here like fall 2019 exclamation, or whatever the time frame is, or however you want. Or maybe, they work at Tesla, so maybe we'll do Tesla 1 if they have a weak password policy, or 123, or @ or pound. You just try a few of these. The only downside to this is you are most likely attacking Active Directory accounts. When you're attacking Active Directory accounts, you want to be very careful because you could lock them out without even trying. So if you're doing a pen test, the best idea is to ask before you attack, say, hey, how many attempts do you have unsuccessfully before a logout happens or a lockout happens? Because the worst thing you want to do is fire off 10 of these in a row, lock out a bunch of users, and cause a denial of service. That is very, very possible and very, very easy to do. So make sure you're not just firing these willy-nilly, that you have a good idea of the password policy, the lockout policy, etc. That'll really help you when you do these attacks. But you just want to do these kind of 1 or 2 at a time, wait a few hours, fire another 1 or 2 at a time, and you should be good to go. Okay, so same deal here. We could fire this and we could just say, I'll just say password 123, and we'll just switch this to sniper here. And if we come to the payloads, you can see it just kept the emails. There is no payload 2 anymore. So what this would do if we hit start attack is it would start firing this against this email address with a password of 123. And then this one with this email address with the password of 123. It would just go down the list. And that's all password spraying is. But the feature that I'm showing you here between credential stuffing and password spraying is by far the most common way that we get in on external assessments. Way, way more than you're ever going to see just an exploit out in the wild, where you're going to see this most likely. And second, you're probably going to see something like default credentials. So if you see a login page, always check default credentials because you never know. You're likely not going to see an exploit out there because the chances are, one, is that if you see an exploit like that out there, who knows who else has seen that already? What kind of bad actors? Because bad actors are scanning the internet all the time for these sorts of things. And if they're seeing it, then guess what? If you're seeing it, then guess what? They're probably have already seen it as well. So that's a bad situation. 2, you got to think of protection, and clients, just think of clients like a house. When you talk about the external of your house, your external, your doors have really good locks on them. You might have 2 locks on your door. You might have good lighting, all this other stuff, right? Like to try to keep bad guys out. But on the inside, some of your doors probably don't even lock. And that's really how you can treat an external assessment. The clients do a really good job of, buffing up their external. But when it comes to the internal, it's not usually as good. So same thing with physical assessments as well. You gotta get inside. Once you're inside, it's kind of easy breezy for the most part. So take that lesson away. If anything you take from the course, again, at least for the external side, take away that enumeration and information gathering is super important, because you want to get to this stage here where you are doing these credential stuffing attacks, and you can use Burp Suite for it. This is my favorite go-to. There's other methods as well, but it's so easy just to grab any different website and just, intercept the proxy, send it to an intruder, make one modification, and fire it off. So super, super simple. This is something you will come up in an interview as well, so make sure you're very aware of it, and make sure you watch this again if you need to understand the concepts. So from here, we're going to go ahead and take a quick look at our notes in the next video, just kind of where I want you to be with your notes. And then we're going to get into what I call that mid-course capstone, where I'm going to show you a bunch of different hacks and just my thought process and theories and thinking when I go into a scan and looking at results, and just so you can kind of get into the mind of an attacker and how we think. And then we'll start moving on to exploit development and my favorite, the Active Directory exploitation. So I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Let's briefly cover our notes so far. So we have covered a little bit of this, right? We covered the fact that we have our nmap in here and what we saw in port 22, port 80, etc. And we had a couple of findings from before. We had default web page on Apache, and we had this information disclosure as well. Now we've done some exploiting. So I've gone ahead and just put in here, I put the SMB exploit. So I put an example of what it looks like when we run it. And you could see that the who am I and the host name's in there. And then I've got the IP address. This is just for my notes. You can make this as detailed as you want, by the way. You could say, hey, I ran this at this specific time, and I ran it against this host, and here was the attack I ran, etc. And we'll get more into what your report should look like, but as long as you know, at least for me, as long as I know, or I have a screenshot of proof that I did it, and I have the IP address that I ran it against, that's pretty much enough. I can remember the rest and then type out the report. And same here with the mod SSL attack on port 80 and 443. And I don't have a copy of it right now, but the shadow file, we did uncover the shadow file as being a root user. So this is just notes for us. Perhaps we could use the shadow file information and crack the passwords, or we could go on and try to pass the password or pass the hash around, which we'll get to in later videos. And another thing that I added in here too was undetected malicious activity. So this is something that you're going to see on a report, and we talked about in the brute forcing video, where if we're doing any kind of brute forcing, we're doing it not only to see if we can get in with a bad password, but to see if the client catches us. So in this example, I'm just going to say, hey, they didn't catch us. Here's an example of what we did. Also scanning in there as well. If they're not seeing a scan, that's something that we're going to report back. So this would be typically a low finding. These would also be low findings. Anytime we get access to a machine, this is obviously a critical finding. So we just want to keep note of, what kind of things we're finding, take good pictures, etc. So I'm hoping that you are getting the gist now of what your notes should look like. Again, make these your own, however it feels good to you. This is just how I kind of do it. I don't have to put a ton of information in there for me to remember, as long as I have my screenshots, which are most important, because that's your proof that you were actually there and you did it. Otherwise, it's just he said, she said kind of thing. So that is it for this video. That is it for this section. Congratulations again for making it this far. Now we're going to move into some of the fun stuff, where we get to look at a bunch of different attacks and gradually just get a little bit more complex and learn some new things along the way. So I will catch you over in the next section. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the exploit development part of our course. I'm really excited about this because we get to start putting together some of the things we've been learning, including Python and MSF Venom to build our own payloads, and it's going to be really fun. So what we're going to be doing in this course is we're going to be using an attack machine and a victim machine. So the victim machine has to be a Windows machine. So you can run it in a VM. I have a VM here. Or you can utilize your own Windows machine if you're running through this course on a Windows-based machine. If you're running on a Mac or you're running on Linux, then you're going to have to virtualize this Windows machine. Now, shouldn't be too big of a deal if you're already running in a VMware situation or a VirtualBox situation. All we have to do is go out to the interwebs here, and if you go to Google and you just type in Windows Evaluation, the first thing that comes up should be Microsoft Evaluation Center. And you just click into there, and we scroll down just a little bit, and it says check out the latest products. We're going to say check out Windows. And right here it says Windows 10 Enterprise. That's fine. Now I'm going to be running the whole course through Windows 10 Pro. It really doesn't matter as long as you're on Windows 7 or newer. So if you have Windows 7, 8, or 10, that's absolutely fine. And then you just click through here, say I want the ISO of Enterprise, and then just fill out all of your information, hit continue, get the ISO file and download it, and then load the ISO file into your VMware. That is the option if you are running it virtualized. If you're on a Windows machine, as I will be when I'm running through the course, you do not have to download this part. Now there are two items you will need to download. Both of these are going to be on your Windows machine. So on your victim machine, we're going to have something called Vuln Server. If you go to Google and say Vuln Server is the vulnerable server that we're going to be attacking. So this is a server that we're going to have running on this machine. It's going to allow us to write a custom exploit against this and get a reverse shell. It's going to be really fun. So we're going to actually use the gray corner right here from 2010. If you click on this and scroll down, there is a download button down here. It says vulnserver.zip. Now Windows may actually block this download. If Windows blocks this download, go ahead and turn off your Defender. I'm going to actually have you turn it off once we start the spiking video, but you can go into Defender and just turn it off in here in Windows Defender settings if you need to. So you have virus and threat protection right here. You can see that I have it turned off. You can just have it turned off. So from here, we can just download our attachment, and I'm just going to hit open because it's a .zip. So again, you're going to need a .zip of some sort. And then I just like to extract this out to my desktop is fine. Just somewhere easy to be able to get to it. And then we can extract the actual or unzip this whole thing right to our desktop. We'll just call this Vuln server like this. Something similar to this is absolutely fine. What's important is that we're able to have all these files on our desktop. So that's exactly what we want here. And then the second part is Immunity Debugger. So if we come over one tab here, we've got Immunity Debugger from Immunity Inc. And this is the link we want to click on. Now what this is going to do is this is going to allow us to run the program through this debugger, and then we can see all sorts of cool stuff. It's a program debugger. So when we are triggering different types of exploits, we can see how it's affecting the memory, the stack, how it's affecting the program, and it'll make a lot more sense once we're in there, but it's really, really nice. So if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see it says download, and it says download Immunity Debugger here. This is all we got to do, and you can put a fake name in here. You can put Joe Schmo, and then however you'd spell that, and then put a 123 fake street, etc. fake at fake.com, and then fake here, and it should let you download it. You don't have to put in your real information, and see it just works right away. Hit save, and then once it's done downloading, we're going to go ahead and get this installed. So if it takes you some time for this to download, go ahead and just pause your video, and then we're going to go ahead and keep going. So I'm going to say run on this and say yes. And it's going to say that it needs to install Python 2.7. So we're just going to say yes and say I accept, next, and install. Close that. Now it's going to launch the Python installer. We're just going to do it for all users. If you have an issue with that, you can install it just for you as well. Next, next, next. Let this load, and it's all very, very point and click on this. So our goal here is to be able to write our own exploit code by the end of this, and it's going to actually be really fun. So let's go check and make sure that immunity ran. And this is what immunity looks like the first time you load it up. So from here, we've got everything installed. We're going to watch a short video on what a buffer overflow is and how we are going to leverage it. And then we're going to get right into the hands-on portion of attacking this victim machine here from our Kali machine and getting a reverse shell off of this victim machine. So I will catch you over in the next video when we start covering what a buffer overflow actually is. So let's talk about anatomy of memory. So when we talk about anatomy of memory, we have the kernel at the top and we've got text at the bottom. So if you think of your kernel, think of your command line. You can also think about this as a bunch of ones. And your text, you can think about as your read-only code, and you can think about that as a bunch of zeros. So this is only for informational purposes, but we can also call this the kernel the top, the text the bottom. Where we're really going to be focused on, though, is going to be the stack. So if we dive into this memory here and we dive even deeper and we go into the stack, it's kind of similar. So we have these registers here, and I'll provide links down below on how to brush up on some of these registers if you're not familiar. But the important things, what we need to know for this lesson, is that you have the ESP, you have your buffer space, your EBP, and your EIP. So we can think about this again as the ESP sitting at the top and the EBP sitting as the bottom. So what happens is you have this buffer space, and this buffer space fills up with characters. So the buffer space is going to go downward. What should happen is if you're properly sanitizing your buffer space, then if you send a bunch of characters at it, say a bunch of A's, for example, like this, you should reach the EBP but stop. The buffer space should be able to contain the characters that you're sending. Now, however, if you have a buffer overflow attack, then you actually overflow the buffer space you're using and reach over the EBP and into something called the EIP. Now, the EIP is where things get interesting. This is a pointer address or a return address. So what we can do is we can use this address to point to directions that we instruct. Now, these directions are actually going to be malicious code that gives us a reverse shell. So we're going to learn that later on in future videos as we go step by step. So this doesn't have to seem very logical right now. You just have to very base level understand that what's happening in the stack is that you're overflowing buffer space. So if you can write over the buffer space and write down all the way to the EIP, you can control the stack and you can control the pointer, and eventually you can have a reverse shell, which will lead to root. So it's going to make a lot more sense when we dive into hands-on. This is just more of a theoretical thing. So let's talk about really quick the steps to conduct a buffer overflow. So the first step we're going to cover is called spiking. So spiking is going to be a method that we use to find a vulnerable part of a program. Once we find the vulnerable part of the program, we're going to do fuzzing, which is kind of similar to spiking. So fuzzing, we're going to send a bunch of characters at a program and see if we can break it. If we do break it, we want to find out at what point we did break it, right? So we want to find something called the offset, and we use that offset to overwrite the EIP, that pointer address that we were talking about. Once we have the EIP controlled, we need to do a few house cleanup things. One is called finding bad characters. The other is called finding the right module. This doesn't need to make sense right now. But once we do that, and we have this information from steps 5 and 6, we can generate shellcode, this malicious shellcode that will allow us to get this reverse shell. So we're going to use that. We're going to point that EIP to our malicious shellcode, and hopefully we're going to gain root. So again, this will all make sense as we dive into the future videos and we get hands-on. So if you look at these videos, these are the videos that are going to come. So our next video is going to be on spiking, second one's going to be on fuzzing, and so on. So if you have trouble with one area in particular, you can watch that area specifically and not have to look through a long video and hopefully break this down into little nuggets. All right, everybody, let's get started with spiking. So before we get started, we're going to do a couple of housekeeping things. First, I want you to disable your Windows Defender real-time protection if you have that enabled. So it looks something like this, where you should turn off this button right here. We're doing that because Vuln Server will actually be blocked by Windows Defender if you try to run it and then run anything malicious against it. So good on Windows Defender for picking this up. This is more recent, as I've taught this in the past. It never used to, but now it does. So we're going to make sure that we turn off this real-time protection. And then we're going to make sure that when we run our programs today, our Immunity Debugger, and we run our Vuln Server, that we're running them as administrator. So let's go ahead and first get our Vuln Server running. So remember, I told you to extract that to a folder. Here's my Vuln Server folder. I'm going to right click on this, and I'm just going to run it as administrator. So now that I've got that running, it should look something like this. And we're also going to run Immunity as administrator. So we're going to do that because if we don't, it's actually not going to see Vuln Server running as administrator and be able to access it. So we need both running as admin. And the other reason is for Vuln Server running as admin is when we get the shell on this, we're actually going to end up as root automatically. So we just want this in the most simple terms. So I'm going to bring Immunity over here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go over here to File, and we're going to say Attach. And if you scroll down, you'll see Vuln Server right here. I'm going to go ahead and just hit Attach on that. Okay, in the bottom right corner, you see that it says pause. What we're going to do is just hit Start over here, this play button up top. And now it should say running. So if you're running, then we are good to go. So now we're going to dive into our Kali Linux machine. So I'm in a command prompt in Kali Linux. And the first thing I want to do is connect to Vuln Server and see what it is. So by default, Vuln Server runs on port 9999. And you need to know the IP address of your Windows machine that it's running on. So once you know that, what we can do is use a tool called netcat. We'll use a switch of NV. We're going to do a connection here. And we're just going to say the IP address. So mine is 1.90. And then the port that you're going to connect on, which is 9999. Okay, so you should see the screen that says Welcome to Vulnerable Server. Type help for help. So it's saying help in all caps. We're going to do that, all caps. And then we get this list of valid commands. So it looks like Vuln Server takes commands based on what you enter, right? So there's a stats command, rtime, ltime, etc. So the primary command that we're going to be focusing on is this trun command. Now, when I've taught this in the past, I've left out actually how to find this. So I wanted to teach in depth how we're going to find that trun itself is vulnerable. So we're going to do something called spiking. What spiking does is we're going to take this command one at a time. We'll say like stats, and we're going to say, hey, stats, I'm going to throw a bunch of characters at you and see if I can overflow that buffer that we talked about in the previous video. So do we overflow the buffer? Does the program crash? If it does, then we know, hey, stats is vulnerable. If it doesn't, okay, maybe it's not vulnerable. We'll move on to the next one. So I'm going to show you what a non-vulnerable one looks like and what a vulnerable one looks like, and we're going to look at stats and trun for that purpose. So when we spike, we're going to use a tool called generic TCP, and it's going to look something like this. Let's go ahead and Control C, or actually we'll just type exit out of this if we can. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use, it's called generic send TCP. Let's type that in real quick. Okay, so here is the usage for this. You're going to need the host. Okay, we know the host of 192.168.1.90. You're going to need the port. We know that. You're going to need a spike script. And then you're going to need these skip variables here, which we're just going to leave at 0. So this is what the usage should look like. But we need this spike script. So let's go ahead and talk about that first. So I've already gone ahead and pre-written it. It's very, very simple. So let's take a look at it in gedit. So first we're going to look at stats. So we're going to have stats.spk for spike. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the line. Then we're going to take a string, and the string is stats. Remember, that's what we had here, the stats command. And then we're just going to send a variable at it. Okay, and then when we spike this, we're going to send variables in all different forms and iterations. So it might send 1,000 at a time, then 20,000 at a time, then 5 at a time. It's just looking for something to break the program. So that's what spiking is. We're going to send all kinds of different characters randomly, essentially, to try to break this part of the program. So now we're getting into specifics here. So if you can imagine, we've got this stats.spike. We're also going to have the trun.spike, and the trun's going to have this trun command here. So if you're following along, make sure that you type this out just how I have it, just these 3 simple lines. Go ahead and save it as stats.spike. And what we're going to do is we're going to send this. So again, we're going to say generic send TCP. And then we know the host is 192.168.1.90. The port is 9999. The spike script is stats.spike. And then we're going to just say 0 space 0. Now, we've got immunity running right now. Over here, if you have multiple screens, you can run it on multiple and kind of watch what happens. If we hit enter here, it's going to just be running through this. This is running. You can see that it's taking commands, but nothing's really happening. We'll let it run through all the way just to make sure. And so you're going to see a little bit of a different action when we do have something vulnerable. So we're going through, looks like we're connecting. If we look at Vuln server, you can see that we're actually connecting to the client here and then disconnecting from the client as we send these commands over. So I'm going to go ahead and just kill this for now. You can hit Control C. Doesn't look like it's vulnerable. In a real test, we'd let it run all the way through, but I'm telling you now it's not vulnerable, so we'll just save a little bit of time. So now let's take a look at the trun spiking. Again, should look the same, but you should have a trun.spike similar to this. So if you want to go ahead and type this out, and we have this trun command here. So when we send this spike, I'm just going to tab up twice and change this to trun. And then again, we have to make sure immunity is running. You see it's running in the corner. We're going to go ahead and hit send on this. And immediately immunity starts blinking. What happened? We have paused over here. There's an access violation when executing. Okay, let's go ahead and just kill the process in Kali because we don't need to keep sending all these. So your Vuln server has actually crashed. You're not seeing an error message because it's being held up by the immunity debugger. If we were to actually detach or unpause this, then Vuln server would crash. So we've hit a violation. This is really good. This says, hey, something's vulnerable here. And if we look at the registers, we can kind of get some information. So one of the informations that we're picking out is, okay, we're seeing this trun command sent, right? And we're sending this trun command with a bunch of A's. So imagine this going into a buffer space, right? Like we talked about before. Okay, we're sending this command, A. In a perfect world, the trun command, or this should all fill into a buffer space, right? All these A's. Well, what's happened here is that it's actually filled over. So if we look at the EBP, remember the base register, right? You see 41414141. That's just hex code for 4 A's. So we've got these here, these 4 bytes, right? And we've gone actually over the ESP as well, a bunch of A's here. Okay, and we've gone over the EIP. So now we've overridden everything. Remember when we talked about in the last video, the EIP is the important factor. If we can control this EIP, we can get malicious and point it to something malicious, right? So that's what we're going to do in the next couple of videos. So I've showed you how trun itself can be spiked and found. In the next video, what we're going to actually be covering is how to fuzz the trun command with a Python script. So that way you can kind of feel out how this process is done in another way called fuzzing. So it's going to be very, very similar where we send a bunch of A's, and it might feel like a little bit of a repeat lesson, but we're going to build out a Python script to do that. And then once we do that, we're going to work on finding this EIP location, because once we control that, again, we can inject malicious code. So step 1 done. I will see you in the next video for fuzzing. All right, everybody. So in this video, we're going to be covering fuzzing. Fuzzing is very similar to spiking in the sense that we're going to be sending a bunch of characters at a specific command and trying to break it. The difference is, with spiking, we're trying to do that to multiple commands to try to find what's vulnerable. Now that we know the trun command is vulnerable, we're going to go ahead and attack that command specifically. So a couple housekeeping items. We're going to go ahead and boot up Immunity Debugger again. So we're going to administrator. And we're also going to run Vuln Server as administrator. So from here on out, you can assume that Vuln Server is going to be running and Immunity is going to be running, and that we're going to have it attached. So let's go ahead and show that process one more time. And anytime that you do crash Vuln Server, we're going to go ahead and restart it and restart Immunity as administrator and reattach. So there are issues sometimes where if you crash Vuln Server and then you try to reload it with Immunity already open, it causes issues. So it's best to just close out of Immunity as well, reopen Immunity, and start it again. So let's go ahead and make sure everything's running. It is in the corner. Okay, so let's go to our Kali machine now that we have this out of the way. And I've built out a script in Python that we're going to use to fuzz. Let's go ahead and take a look at that script. So we're going to say gedit. I called this 1.py. You could do that as well. And if you want to pause the video now and write this out, copy this down, that's fine. You could also do it while I'm talking if you want to save some time. So I'm just going to go line by line and kind of talk about this code, and then we'll see what it does. So from the top, we're just declaring that it's Python. We're going to import a few modules here. We're going to import sys and socket. That way that we can call out the specific IP and port. We're also going to import sleep. That way we can sleep it for a second before trying this process over again. So with those imports out of the way, what we're really focused on is we're declaring a buffer variable here, right? So this variable is called buffer, and inside buffer we have 100A. So we've got this A times 100. So what we're going to do is we're going to say while true. So we're going to loop this, right? We're going to say while true, I want you to try something. What we're going to try is we're going to try to connect to this socket. And the socket, all that is this AFI net, that's your IPv4, and the sock stream, that's your port. So we're going to say, hey, let's connect to this IP address. Remember, this is my IP address for my Windows machine that's running Vuln Server. So we're going to connect to this IP address. We're going to connect to this port. And then once we do that, we're going to send over a trun command. Remember, we spiked the trun command, found it was vulnerable. And when we spiked it, when we looked at the registers, we actually saw this little bit of extra information here. So we've got this little command that goes after the trun that needs to go in there in order for the program to actually understand it. So that's why this has been added here. So we say, hey, send over this message, send over trun, and then also send over the buffer. So send trun with 100 A's. Okay, then close that connection, go to sleep for a second, and then we're going to append to buffer another 100 A's. So what we're going to keep doing is, as long as there's a connection here, we're going to keep sending you buffers. And it's going to get bigger and bigger. So next time we're going to send 200, then we're going to send 300, 400, etc. until this thing breaks. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to really narrow down where it's breaking and at what specific byte size. So what we're doing here is we're going to fuzz it. And then once it breaks, it should print out an exception that says, okay, fuzzing's crashed at X bytes, right? So let's go ahead and see what that's going to look like. So go ahead and save this file if you haven't already. One other important thing we need to do is we need to change the mode on this to execute. So we'll say change mode +x 1.py. That way we can execute this. And just again to confirm, we've got Immunity running. So let's go ahead now and say 1.py. Hit enter. And you should see the connections coming through here on Vuln Server. So every time it's doing this, it's sending a new 100 bytes. We can watch Immunity for the crash. The crash should happen pretty quick. And then once it does, you can kill the program, because sometimes it doesn't kill itself. So it's not the best. There we go. We paused it. No more connections. So let's go ahead, go into Kali, hit Control C, and we crashed somewhere around 2,700 bytes, give or take. Okay, so let's look at the crash. So again, we see the crash came through, and we've got a bunch of A's sitting here. We didn't look like we actually overwrote the EIP. That's fine. We just need to know approximately where we crashed at. So we'll just call it, for even round numbers, that we crashed somewhere around 3,000 bytes. So what we're going to be doing in the next video is we're actually going to be finding where the EIP is at. So how we're going to do that is we're going to use a tool that's going to create these random, not really random, there's cyclical values that we're going to send out. And then we're going to say, okay, what is the EIP value and where does it correspond in specific number of bytes that we sent over? So remember, controlling this EIP value, let's go back to it. Controlling this EIP value is what's the most important. Once we can control this EIP value, we do a little bit of housekeeping in our exploit development process, and then we point this guy to our malicious code and we get root. So we want this EIP, we want to control it, and in the next couple of videos, we're going to learn how to do just that. So I will catch you over in the next video when we cover finding the offset. So when we talk about finding the offset, we kind of talked about in the last video, we're going to be looking for where we overwrite the EIP because that's what we want to control. Now, lucky for us, there is a tool already out there that will help us do this. And this tool is provided by Metasploit Framework. It's called Pattern Create. So in our Kali machine, we're going to go ahead and just get that set up. So what we're going to do is we're going to say user share Metasploit Framework tools exploit pattern create. Okay, now we're going to have to give this a couple switches. Actually, just one for the first one. We're going to give it a switch of L for length. And the switch of L, we're going to say 3,000. So why 3,000? Well, if you remember the last video, what happened was we found somewhere around 2,700 bytes is where the Vuln server program crashed. And then I said, hey, let's just make it an even 3,000. It'll be nice. This is where it comes into play. So we're going to take 3,000 bytes and we're going to hit enter here. What's going to happen is it's going to generate this crazy cyclical code here that we're going to actually have to send into Immunity and Vuln server. So you see all this jumbled stuff. All we're going to do is just take it and we're going to copy it. And then we're going to modify our script that we created earlier just a little bit. And I've gone ahead and done that. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So let's go ahead. I called it 2.py. If you want to modify your 1.py and make it easier from the last video. And then I did a little test here just to make sure it worked. But what we're going to do is we're going to paste this value into here, but first I want to cover this script. So remove some things, remove the time because we don't need it. We still have the import sys and socket. We don't need a while loop anymore. We can just say try. And we're going to do the same connection, just try in the connection, make sure we connect to that address. And then we're going to send this offset, right? So I'm going to go ahead and paste that value into here. You can go ahead and work on getting this set up. What we're going to do is we're going to send this value and then we're going to close the connection. If for some reason we cannot access it, then we'll throw an exception and say error connecting to server, and then we'll exit out. So what we're going to do is when we send this in, we're going to get a value on the EIP. So we're going to see that the program crashes and then the value on the EIP is going to come back. And then we're going to use a tool and we're going to say, hey, okay, Metasploit, I found this value on the EIP. What is the offset? So we've got this pattern create right now, and then we're going to have pattern offset here in a second. So let's go ahead and get this saved up. Once you're ready, go ahead, hit save. Same thing again, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to change the mode like we did last time to execute on 2.py. And also we're going to need to get Immunity running and Vuln server running. So I'm going to do that really quick here. Okay, it should look like this. Hit play, make sure we're running in the bottom, and then go ahead and fire off that script. Okay, should throw an exception right away. And you see now that we have this trun command that came through with our values that we sent, right? You see this cyclical value goes to the A's. It crosses over the EBP, down the EIP, even comes through the ESP, right? So what we're doing here is we have completely overwritten everything. We've gone too far because we've crossed this ESP, but really what we're interested in is this EIP. We want to be able to control this value. So we see this value in here is 386F4337 right here. This is what we need and we're interested in. So let's see how we can make this value of use. So if we come back to the screen and let's just tab up a couple and we'll go here and just backspace. What we're going to say is instead of pattern create, all we're going to say is pattern offset. We're going to give it the same switch of L and we're going to say 3000. But one thing we need to add in here is a switch of Q, and that's for our finding. So our finding was 386 F as in Foxtrot 4337. And now if we hit enter here and we did it right, we should find a pattern offset, meaning that somewhere inside of these 3000 bytes, it found this pattern and it relayed back to it. So if you see here, we actually do have an exact offset match at 2003 bytes. This information is critical because that tells us now that at 2003 bytes, we can control the EIP. And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next video. We're going to look at the EIP and see if we can control it. So we're going to try to overwrite it with very specific bytes and see if those bytes show up. So let's go ahead and move on to there. Okay, so now we're going to try to overwrite the EIP. So in the last video, we discovered that the offset was at 2003 bytes. What that means is there's 2003 bytes right before you get to the EIP, and then the EIP itself is 4 bytes long. So what we're going to try to do is overwrite those 4 specific bytes. So as always, go ahead and get your immunity debugger running with Vuln server attached. When you have that, let's go ahead and hop right into Kali Linux. This should be a pretty short video. So what we're going to do is let's go ahead and just gedit the last script that we wrote, which was 2.py. And we're going to modify this together. So what we can do here is we can just delete this offset variable because we don't need that anymore. And instead, we can just write shellcode here. And we'll switch out this offset variable to shellcode. And then let's go ahead and set this equal to A times 2003 plus B times 4. So let's make sense of this real quick. We're replacing what we sent before to find the offset with the shellcode. Now the shellcode is nothing but A's and B's right now, but it's going to get malicious in a minute. So what we're doing here is we're sending 2003 A's. Why? Because that's where the EIP starts. So byte 2004 starts the EIP. So what we're doing is we're sending a bunch of A's, but we want to make sure that we don't overwrite the EIP with A's and have no idea if we're correct or not. So remember, A's are 4 1s, B's is going to then be 4 2. So in theory, we should see 4 2, 4 2, 4 2, 4 2 on the EIP when we overwrite it. So let's go ahead and just fire this guy off. I'm going to save this, and you could save it as .3 if you want. I'm just going to keep it .2 to make it simple. And then what we're going to do is 2.py. Remember, if you did make it a new file, go ahead and change the mode. And since we have Vuln server running and attached to Immunity Debugger, we should just be able to fire this guy off. And it should break the program. So we have pause down here, access violation, great. Okay, so let's talk about what happened here. So you see the EAX, Trun ran through, bunch of A's, we're used to seeing that. EBP, 41414141, good, came through, but look here, the EIP is 42424242. Now we only sent 4 bytes of B's and they all landed on the EIP. Guess what? That means we control this EIP now. So from here, it's pretty smooth sailing. We got a couple of housekeeping things we got to do in terms of finding bad characters and finding the right module to send this to. But once we do that, we're going to generate some shellcode. We're going to point this EIP here instead to that return address that's going to be malicious, and then we're going to gain root. So hopefully this makes sense. Again, just to reiterate, we have controlled the EIP, and now we're going to start to get malicious. So in the next video, we're going to talk about finding bad characters. Okay, so now we're going to talk about finding bad characters. When we talk about finding bad characters, we're talking about